Good morning, guys. I'm happy to have you guys back, and I am happy to be talking about, well, maybe not happy, but we are going to be talking about World War I today. So as a historian, I really enjoy learning about World War I. I'm fascinated by it. It's a very interesting conflict in human history. And in my opinion, it's also possibly one of the stupidest wars ever fought over the course of humanity. And I say that knowing that Australia once fought a war against birds. Look it up. It's called the Emu War. That all being said, World War I is absolutely horrific. And I'm sure many of you have seen Hollywood films about World War I. Last year, 1917 came out and it was stunning. Maybe you've seen the trench warfare scene in Wonder Woman. But this war, when we talk about the conduct of this war, we all have to remember just how horrific it really is. Okay, the men and women who fought in this war, the men who fought in those trenches, at the end of the war, they're part of something called the lost generation for a reason. Because at the end of the war, when these men returned, those that survived, the horrors that they experienced in the trenches on the war fronts were so unspeakable and so horrific that even now, these countries are actively trying to forget World War I, which is one reason why, unfortunately, we don't really teach it. But lucky for you guys, College Board wants you to know about World War I, and so I'm going to do my best to teach it for you guys as well. So as you can see, this is this cover screen right here. This is no man's land. Okay, this is the area between the trenches, the two sides of the war. Dark, burnt, decaying. All right, there are dead bodies here, bodies that you can't really go ahead and pull out, or you might get shot from an enemy. All right, we'll look at more pictures of the trenches and no man's land, but I need you to understand how horrific this is going to look. So guys, we are still in period 4, all right? We will be in period 4 the remainder of this class. Still talking about global conflicts. Specifically, we are talking about how World War I will be carried out. And as usual, if you are missing class, please shoot me an email so I can get you the in-class work that you missed. So a couple memes for you. I love this meme. Yeah, guys, you just got served. Poor Franz Ferdinand. All right, guys. So in this class, as I've told you, we have historical thinking skills. All right, we have cause and effect, we have similarity and difference, and we have change and continuity. And when we're talking about World War I and World War II, College Board really wants you only to know a few things. They only want you to know the causes of the war, and they only want you to know the effects of the war. They also want you to know how each war is conducted. So I want to make sure you guys have a more fruitful understanding of what happened during World War I. So I'm going to give you some more information than you maybe need for your AP World Test. Okay, so what we're looking at right now on this screen, this is probably not going to be on your AP World Test. But I think the first 6 weeks of World War I are critical to understanding the remainder of the conflict. All right, most of you guys probably know of World War I as a war between the trenches. All right, both sides dig down into the soil and shoot at each other, okay, across that area in the middle called no man's land. But the first 6 weeks of the war, this is not trench warfare. All right, the first 6 weeks of World War I is a war of movement. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. After Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, all right, the Austro-Hungarian Empire asks Germany, you going to help us or not? And Germany hands over the blank check to Austria-Hungary. All right, and in that moment, all right, Serbia is also going to ask for assistance from the Russians. The Russians will begin mobilization. But from what we know about the Russians is that they are slow, they are disorganized. And so the Germans expect mobilization. Okay, so the mobilization is essentially the calling up troops and getting them to move along the borders so that these armies can confront each other. So the Germans expect the Russian mobilization to be very slow because the Russians are disorganized. They're primarily poor, right? Besides the Tsar, they really want nothing to do with this war. And so what Germany decides is, instead of confronting the Russians on the eastern border, what Germany will do is they'll take their entire army and they will knock out France. Remember, France and Russia are in an alliance together. So while the Russians are slowly mobilizing on the Eastern Front, if Germany goes ahead, invades, and knocks out France extremely quickly, then that will knock France out of the rest of the war. And so Germany can take all of its troops and then confront the Russians on the eastern border. Now, in order to make this plan happen, all right, Germany has to be quick. All right, Germany has to move all of their troops very, very quickly into France, and Russia also has to move very, very slowly. Now, Germans have been perfecting this plan for decades, and this plan is called the Schlieffen Plan. Please write that down. That's going to be on Jeopardy one day, and you're going to get it right. In order for Germany to quickly and rapidly knock out France, Germany has to go ahead and march through a tiny country called Belgium. Now, we learned about Belgium. We talked about how evil Belgium was in the Congo. Let that go. But Belgium's kind of a hero in this story. All right, Belgium is a neutral nation, which means they're not allied with anyone. So when Germany invades Belgium, okay, the British, who have a sort of protectorate alliance, like Belgium is neutral, so stay the heck away from Belgium. So once Germany invades Belgium, Britain is sort of forced into the war, okay? And we've talked about this already. Now, guys, everyone assumes that Belgium is not going to fight, all right? But Belgium actually puts up a really strong and powerful fight against the Germans. All right, they actually hold the German army off longer than expected and allow the French and British to mobilize, okay? Eventually, though, because Belgium is so small, the German army, the huge, massive army, is going to march right through Belgium and come into France. All right, and remember, they're trying to knock the French out. At this point, the British Expeditionary Force, the British Army, arrives and will help the French. Now, the Germans get so very close. They get within 30 kilometers of Paris. All right, and once you take Paris, the French will have to be kicked out of the war. And the British fought very powerfully. All right, the French did as well. But the German army, the entire powerful, mobilized, modernized, and industrialized German army is going to just roll over the French and the British, okay? Roll over the Belgians. However, the French get lucky because the Russians actually mobilize much quicker than anyone anticipated. So Germany has to take some of its forces and move them to the Eastern Front to confront the Russians. And so what eventually happens, guys, is at a place called the Marne, and you don't have to know that, the Germans and the French kind of have a stalemate. All right, Germany is not able to take Paris, but they have moved in to France. All right, and France is able to hold the German line. And by the middle of September, more and more British soldiers are going to arrive to assist the French. But we're at a stalemate now, guys. And what happens is that both sides dig. All right, they create something called trenches. And World War I is kind of the first major war where you see the proliferation of trench warfare. And we're going to take a look at what the trenches looked like. But I need you to think about this for a second, guys. If you go outside right now after a rainstorm and you dig a pit of mud, how you can hide into that, and that's great, but it's still super dirty and still muddy. And when it rains, it's going to get more and more muddy. And that's your home for the entire rest of the 5 years of this war, okay? So trench warfare, guys. Again, this is pretty much one of the first examples of trench warfare in history. So you did see a little bit of trench warfare in the American Civil War, or especially towards the end, but you don't really see it on the mass scale that you see trench warfare in World War I. Now, World War I in many cases is probably one of the first modern wars. Right? When we talk about modern wars, we're talking about the industrialization of warfare, machines, modern military. Okay. When we think about Napoleon and we think about how he crossed Europe atop a horse, taking over all of these lands in the early 1800s, and 100 years later, just 100 years later, warfare changes to the point that it's almost unrecognizable. Okay. We have new weapons and the conduct of the war changes. Okay. We have things like barbed wire. All right. That really painful, sticky wire that we have where you can't really touch it without getting cut up. All right. We now have airplanes. Airplanes are originally used during World War I to kind of spy upon the enemy. You also have machine guns. All right. Machine guns versus the cavalry, all right, the horses. That's not going to end well for the horses. Right? By the end of the war, we have tanks. All right, they're not the cool tanks that we see in World War II, but they are tanks. We have artillery. All right, we can fire at far distances. And the scariest of all is poison gas. All right, we can kill our enemy, our faceless enemy in a trench on the just over there by sicking poisonous gas on them, chlorine gas, mustard gas. Industrial warfare is going to increase human casualties, okay? Millions and millions of British, French, Germans, Ottomans, okay, Austro-Hungarians, Serbians, Italians, Japanese, Americans are going to die in World War I. Now, when both sides dig in and create these new trenches, there is land in between the two trenches, all right? The German trench and the French trench, they're firing on each other, and there is land in the middle. And we're gonna call that no man's land, all right? Because no man really has any control over it. And no man's land becomes a horrific wasteland full of barbed wire and dead bodies, dead horses, all right? Disease, mud, horror, okay? And when both sides go to fight against each other, when men rise out of the trenches and try to cross no man's land, all right, not only is the other side going to be shooting machine guns at them, but they're also going to be running through dead bodies in mud pits, barbed wire. It's horrendous. Trench warfare is going to turn this war into an endless, futile struggle. There'll be lots of death, mud, heat, sickness, injury, lack of food. All right, and that's going to be on the Western Front. All right, the Eastern Front, which we're talking about Germany versus Russia, Western Front is Germany and France. All right, the Eastern Front will end earlier than the rest of the war. Russia will surrender to Germany, and that's a whole other story that we will get to. But I want you to really think about the human tragedy that we're going to talk about when we talk about the conduct of this war. All right, I think these pictures are helpful. All right, this is a machine gun right here, but it also fires chlorine gas. That's why these men are wearing these gas masks. All right, they're firing off poisonous gas to kill faceless men in other trenches. It's a horrifying, horrifying way of warfare. Now, I wanted you to get a sense of what no man's land looks like. All right, I could sit here and describe the mud and despair and like horrificness of it, but until you see it, it's hard to really visualize it. Nobody can live here, guys. And this is where these men have to fight this war in this no man's land. This is a cool photo, all right? This is an aerial view from an airplane looking down at the trenches. So you can see probably this is the first trench on the French side and maybe the first trench on the German side. How these men will fight each other, all right? They will rise out of the trench and shoot machine guns at each other. This is why the war becomes a stalemate. This is a colorized version of the first picture on that first slide I showed you. No man's land. It's horrific. And these men have to live in this trench warfare for 4 to 5 years. Now, guys, I said to you when we talked about the main reasons for World War I told you about how part of nationalism was this romantic idea of war. All right, boys go off to war and come back as men. Well, about 5 minutes into World War I, people begin to realize that those ideas of glory and romanticism of war, that ain't real at all. Okay? All of that nationalism and that fierce love of one's country, that imperialism, okay, the militarism, all of that stuff is going to settle into this trench warfare for 4 years. That's going to drain the population of France, Britain, and Germany. Okay, it's going to destroy their natural resources. All right. They got a lot of natural resources from imperialism, so don't feel too bad for them. But an entire generation of men will be killed in this war. Okay. Those that return home at the end of the war are going to be known as the lost generation. So at this time, guys, post-traumatic stress disorder doesn't actually exist. At this time, it's called shell shock. All right. But these men return from this conflict after seeing their best friends shot to pieces in the trenches. All right. And they're never, ever really going to be able to talk about the horror that is World War I. And as I said, guys, it is such a ridiculously stupid conflict. These governments sent their young men to die. And I wanted you to get a sense of what these trenches looked like, okay? All trenches are, in essence, basically dug out little areas where men will put their guns here and try to shoot the opponent on the other side. I will say that the Germans had much cleaner and nicer trenches, but all trenches are pretty horrific. Now, one component of World War I that I need you guys to understand in the conduct of this war is that for the first time in history, we see something called total war. All right, what is total war? Well, look at that word, total. It is when the entirety of society, all right, the totality of men, women, children are mobilized to fight the conflict, okay? So when we think about Napoleonic wars, when we think about early wars that we've talked about in this class, all right, women and children often aren't really called up in an effort to fight the war, okay? Total war is when all of society, all right, including children at school, women are required to participate. Okay, so while men are on the front in those trenches, are fighting the conflict, women have to take their places in the factories. All right, women have to be the ones to build airplanes, all right, to make bullets, to make guns. Children at school are also required to participate in this war. Okay, children are encouraged to save their money and buy war bonds to fund the war. Children are encouraged to find scrap metal and donate it to create more bullets. All right, children are learning every day at school nationalism and why my country is better than all others. All right, the attitude towards women will change because of total war. All right, while men are sent to the front, women are going to be expected to go to work. All right, and that's a big change. All right, historically, women, for the most part, don't work in factories. All right, at least, lower class women work in factories. Now it is everybody, the totality of society will be forced to work in factories in order to proliferate this war. And that is going to change the overall attitude towards women. All right, women are going to be held higher up at the end of World War I. Not American women, but French, German, and British women. So as men are going to be marching and fighting on the front, these women will be expected to work in factories. They'll be expected to farm, and they'll be expected to do all that men used to do because they are expected to be participants in total warfare. Okay? Now, another component of what you see in World War I is this new, this is also part of total war, is this new propaganda. All right, you have to sell this war to the folks back home. All right, remember, people don't, when they hear about the horror, all right, sending off their sons to fight in these trenches in France and Belgium, when they hear about how horrific these things are, why would they want to participate and support this war? Well, you got to convince them that this is a good thing. And you're going to start to see for the first time in history, and certainly not the last, propaganda will be used. Okay, not even just propaganda. All right, music, movies, television shows, all of these things will be used to rally the populations at home. All right, these are just two small examples. Women of Britain say go. Okay, this is a propaganda poster that really encourages men. You go fight and we'll stay behind. All right, we got this. All right. Make sure you understand propaganda will be used and it will be different. We're going to go through some propaganda examples in a second. German propaganda is very different than British propaganda. All right, British propaganda often makes the enemy look like a demon, devil, cannibalistic, evil, like devil, whereas German propaganda more or less makes the other side look stupid. So here's an example of German propaganda, guys. Okay, it's kind of cute, actually. So it's German, tight and loyal, you brave boys, until our enemies are defeated. All right, I like this poster because I think it kind of humanizes our soldiers, right? So we've got a German soldier. One of these is an Austrian soldier, an Ottoman soldier here. All right, all the sides of, the Central Powers. All right, those are your kids right there. You want to support them because even if it's not your son, it's somebody's child. Some other, all right, this is British propaganda. And as I said, guys, British propaganda was made to make the Germans look like brutes, savages. Okay, remember Belgium. This is a very suggestive poster. Who knows what this German soldier is going to do to this poor Belgian woman. All right, and this one, you can even see the German hat that says militarism. All right, culture. What is this mad brute, this Hun, what is he going to do to this beautiful British or French woman? All right, who knows? Another British propaganda piece. All right, remember, suggesting that the Germans are brutes and savages. All right, the monthly report of murder. All right, babies, children, women. A good month's business. 164 babies dead is a good month's business. Okay. All right, eventually America will get into this war. It will be towards the end, and we'll talk about that in a second. But America will also engage in this propaganda. All right, wake up, America, civilization calls. This is kind of a civilizing mission right here. Now, part of total warfare, guys, remember when the totality of society is forced to participate in this war. Now, if you're a global empire and you have colonies abroad, the totality of your society is also the colonies. So what you'll start to see, guys, is colonial soldiers. The British will call up Indians. They will call up Africans. All right. The French as well will call up West Africans to fight. The British will also call up Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians. Everyone that is part of the sun never sets on the British Empire will be forced to fight. And think about that. If you're an Indian, why the heck would you fight in Europe during this ridiculous conflict? Well, you probably don't have a choice. All right. If you are a member of the Indian Army, all right, and you're part of that global British Empire, you're going to Europe to fight. Okay. Now, I don't often say this, but World War I for Australians and New Zealanders is pretty much a terrible time to be a white guy. Now, when colonial troops, because of racism, all right, people of color were often used sort of as support. All right, they were used in the 3rd and 4th trenches, certainly not the 1st and 2nd. But the British often used Australians and New Zealanders, white boys, to fight World War I. All right, they were sort of the elite soldiers of the British Army. Now, I want you to think about this. Australia and New Zealand had a gun culture. All right, these were all farm boys. They knew how to use guns. So of course they were going to be used in the front lines of the British Army because they were much more savvy with technology or with guns. All right, let me ask you this. Would you guys prefer an army made up of boys from Alabama or city slickers from New York City? Probably boys from Alabama. And it's the same thing. All right, Australia and New Zealand had a gun culture. And so Australia and New Zealanders were the elite soldiers of the British Army. And they fought on the Western Front alongside of other British boys. And they fought at a place called Gallipoli. All right, they fought against the Ottomans. And Gallipoli was horrific. All right, it was a mass slaughter of these Australian troops. Even to this day, Australians talk about Gallipoli. Now, we just went through the war pretty quick, right? Well, we got to talk about the end of the war. And in our next class, we'll talk about the effects of the war. Now, I haven't really mentioned that much about the United States. And that's because the US does not join World War I basically until the very last second. All right, in the true American spirit of waiting until the last minute and then coming in and kicking butt, that is exactly what's going to happen. So the war begins in 1914. All right, 1915, 1916, 1917. All right, so 4 years have gone by, or 3.5 years have gone by. In Russia, there is a revolution, a brewing in 1917. All right, the communists are about to take over. And when the communists take over, the Russians will be pulled out of the war. The Russians will surrender to Germany. Okay, those Russians who came in and saved the French in the beginning of the war, well, they're going to step back. And it's not going to be so good. Now, in preparation for this final attack, now that Russia is out of the war, Germany can shift all its troops to the Western Front. So in preparation for this major Western attack, Germany is going to announce a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. So Americans, during this whole war, are going to be selling equipment and weapons to both sides because, of course, always looking for the mighty dollar. All right, so American banks are going to be making a crap ton of money on the British, the French, and the Germans. So America is quote unquote neutral. Now, American banks are also making a crap ton of money because they're lending money to the British and the French. All right, American banks are lending money to the British and the French to buy American goods. This is kind of like the perfect situation. All right, we're going to give you money, which you're going to pay interest on, and then you're going to buy our goods. So we're going to win, and you're not. Now, America would have stayed neutral the entire time if it wasn't for this unrestricted submarine warfare, because once the Germans essentially declare war on American boats selling goods to the British, the Americans kind of have to get involved. On top of that, something called the Zimmermann Telegraph goes through. All right, the German Kaiser sends Mexico a telegraph that asks Mexico to declare war on the US, all right, on the side of Germany. All right, so if the Kaiser or the Zimmermann realizes that if Mexico can distract the United States will not assist Great Britain and France. Now, this really, as you can imagine, this pisses off the Americans, really, truly angry. All right, the Germans, essentially, America had wanted to be neutral, and the Germans just asked Mexico to attack. So America's going to join the war. And America has not been fighting this war for 3.5 years. All right, American troops are young. They still have romantic ideas about war, and they are excited to get to the Western Front to kick some German butts. So in 1917, Russia surrenders. And in 1918, Germany takes all their troops and amasses it at the western border. But the good news is that by the time they're able to do this, American troops are there. All right. American boys flood these trenches. And so fresh blood, fresh bodies, all right, fresh people to shoot at, I guess. And American economic and military might essentially cause the Germans to collapse. All right. Germany cannot win against America now that all these fresh new troops and all of this money, all right, is now on the Western Front. And so Germany will surrender on November 11th in 1918. So next year when you celebrate Veterans Day, November 11th, that is, Veterans Day is historically Armistice Day when the Germany surrendered. And while all this sounds great and wonderful, 20 million people on all sides of the conflict are dead. All right, civilians, soldiers, Germans, French, British, Americans, Japanese, Italians, all of these people. It is an ugly, ugly conflict, all right? Industrial warfare, new weaponry, and it ends in 1918. And we don't really know how it's going to end, all right? Germany surrenders, but what does that even mean? Okay, what does that actually mean? Germany surrenders after 4.5 years of conflict. They surrender, but what are we gonna hold Germany accountable? Are we gonna make them pay for all the crimes that they committed, even though no side is really the true villain out here? And I want you guys to be thinking about that for the next class. All right, who was the hero? Who is the villain? Because there really isn't one in World War I. All right, we know in World War II there is a villain. All right, there is truly a bad guy and a good side. All right, there is true good and evil. But with World War I, it's much more complicated. All right, it's harder to say who was the villain when both sides just were stupid. All right, this ends the so-called war to end all wars. That's what World War I was called. We know that that's not true at all. But I want you guys to be thinking about that. All right. In the next class, we will talk about the effects of World War I and what it means for society, guys. But if you've missed class and you're watching this to get your notes, please make sure to email me, okay? And I will get you guys the information that you missed, or I'll get you guys the in-class work. If not, have a great rest of your day, and I will see you guys in class.